welcome everybody to our hopefully interesting discussion about the Green New Deal. I'm Christine Gilligan-Kubo from Sheffield Hillsborough Green Party. And before we start, there's a few items of housekeeping. I'm sure you're all familiar with them now because we've done so many Zooms, but if you could please keep muted unless you're talking. I also have to let you know that this session will be recorded. So if you're uncomfortable with that, please let us know through the chat function. Eamon will be monitoring the chat function. So questions, comments will be taken at the end through the chat function. And I think that's all the housekeeping.
Yep.
So the Green New Deal. Just a little bit about it before we start, and I don't want to take everything because I'm sure Richard and Rosh have a great deal to say, but Caroline Lucas of the Green Party was widely talking about this in 2007, and actually in 2019, along with Clive Lewis MP, she introduced a bill to legislate for a Green New Deal in the UK Parliament. So it's, you know, quite a long-standing issue. And I think it is gaining more acceptance gradually, which can't be a bad thing. So I'm pretty sure, looking at the faces here, that you all know what the principle behind the Green New Deal is, but for anybody who doesn't, it's about how we use public government money, basically, and it's to support actions that have beneficial social and/or environmental outcomes. And it's particularly relevant in this time of climate change when we're trying to get to zero emissions. So it can be a very useful tool because it will enable us to get there whilst at the same time promoting green jobs. You know, things like solar panels, home insulation, etc. will produce green jobs. They'll reduce our energy use, and they'll also help people with their bills. So it's about cutting carbon, creating jobs and boosting the natural environment. And in Sheffield, the Green Party, you know, some of the policies we've promoted that kind of fit the Green New Deal. We want new housing to be within 30 minutes walk of the city centre to promote walking and cycling. And we want high standard, low energy, warm homes for all through refurbishments to save carbon, reduce heating, create local jobs. So in a nutshell, that's just a quick overview of what some of the issues of the Green New Deal are. And I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more. Our first speaker is Rosh Lal from, as he says up there, the Green New Deal UK. Rosh describes himself as an activist who is concerned with building broad coalitions to win the society we need. He volunteers for the Green New Deal UK and he founded South Yorkshire Resettlement Group. So Lal is going to talk to us for about 5 minutes. So over to you, Rosh.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Roche. Thanks for inviting me to speak tonight. I don't want to take up too much of your time, as Richard is the real expert here. I just want to outline why a Green New Deal is so important and what the Green New Deal UK hub in South Yorkshire are working on. So there is a lot of hand-wringing in established environmental groups that they're mostly comprised of the white, worried and well-off. In my experience, this is broadly true, but that is because it's a reflection of the underlying class structure of this country. Black, brown and working class people can't be expected to organise in spaces that reflect the interests, language and prejudices of the white middle classes, especially when the struggles of black, brown and working class people have been ignored for too long. This is made obvious by the grotesque inequality in our country and the fact we have a public health crisis that disproportionately affects BAME folk. Any environmentalism that ignores this class dynamic is, as Chico Mendes said, just gardening. The Green New Deal recognises that if we are to truly enact the economic and social transformation we need to meet the urgency of the climate crisis, we must build the broadest coalition possible to bring about that change. It's a policy framework that recognises that the economy works for too few people, with insecure, low-paid work the norm for too many, and structural racism blighting our criminal justice, education, and employment systems. The Black Lives Matter movement reminds us that too many are unable to breathe under the threat of police violence and racism, but also from environmental racism as well, which includes the poisonous air quality that blights too many of our cities. So Green New Deal UK is a national organisation launched last year. There are hubs all over the country, and we recognise that the problem is too big to be owned by any one party or organisation. We are non-party affiliated, but there are members from different parties or people with no affiliation. We need a movement of movements, of the trade unions, conservationists, climate strikers, faith communities, and key workers. We are open to collaborating with anyone who wants to build a narrative about the necessary transformation we need to undertake together in a language that is most relevant to people's material concerns. So that's decent unionized jobs, decent housing, energy and food security, dignity and respect in the face of the multiple crises we're looking at. Our hub is focusing on the Sheffield City region and the powers and funding made possible by the city mayor position. We've made progress on pushing for retrofitting of the housing stock and on promoting nature-friendly, sustainable food practices. We are now focused on the local elections and getting candidates who support the Green New Deal into the council. Our next campaign is part of the National Action on Green Skills and Jobs. I'd like to invite you all to come onto our call on the 22nd of March. We have a vision of a new economy where people can look forward to working on restoring nature, building resilience to future climate shocks, draft-proofing our leaky housing, and installing renewables that will see the end of fuel poverty in the region. Everyone is welcome in helping us build that future because we will need everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rush. And as I said earlier, questions, if you could put them in the chat and we'll try and take them all at the end. But now I'm delighted to welcome Richard Murphy, who I'm sure for most of you doesn't need an introduction, but I will just give him a brief one. He is a British chartered accountant and political economist who campaigns on issues of tax avoidance and tax evasion. And according to the Guardian newspaper, he's an anti-poverty campaigner and tax expert. He was a professor of practice in international political economy at the City University. He's a director of Tax Research UK and a member of the Progressive Economy Forum. He was a co-founder of the Tax Justice Network and the Green New Deal, as well as the Fair Tax Mark. And according to the International Tax Review, he was the 7th most influential person in global tax in 2013. By 2017, he was 9th on the list. Richard at the moment is a visiting academic at the University of Sheffield in the management school. So hopefully we'll see more of him in Sheffield. I hope I haven't missed anything off your illustrious career, Richard. So over to you.
Look, hello, good evening. Thank you for asking me to speak this evening. And I'm really pleased to, because the Green New Deal is something I'm passionate about. The Green New Deal grew out of a group of us, and Rosh, your description of us is right. Most of us have got white hair. Most of us are white. In fact, all of us were white at the time. And yeah, I guess we're middle class. And we were meeting in 2007, 2008. That group was brought together by Colin Hines, who's the coordinator still of the Green New Deal group. Caroline Lucas was a member, Anne Pettifor, Larry Elliott, the economics editor of The Guardian, Jeremy Leggett, who founded Solar Century, Andrew Sims, who have been at the New Economics Foundation, me, one or two others. It's been a little sort of loose and flexible over the years. We realized that there was a coming economic crisis. We also all agreed from our various backgrounds that there was another crisis, and that crisis was, of course, in fact, a triple crisis, really. It wasn't just that the economy was going to fail. We all were sure of that. And Anne Pettifor and I in particular were absolutely certain about this. I worked heavily around disclosure of how Northern Rock failed, which was in 2007 and was, of course, a precursor to the crisis of 2008. But we knew there was going to be a fuel, make it a fuel and climate crisis, because the two, of course, are related to each other. And there was a food and make it a biodiversity crisis as well. So, we use fuel, climate, food, biodiversity, economics as the answer as to how we had to reorganize society. And so in July 2008, we put out our first report, which was how to basically avert the coming crisis. The crisis, of course, exploded in September 2008 when we saw Lehman Brothers collapse. And that gave us a platform because we had said there was going to be a crisis and we had offered solutions before the crash that we might not otherwise have got. And what did we say? And what are we saying, since? What has changed? Fundamentally, we were saying it was the job of government to intervene in the economy to tackle these crises, but to do so in a way that had not been imagined before. Since I was fairly young, I'm now 63, I can well remember the 1970s, and I was politically engaged in the 70s, and I actually was reading green material way back then. In fact, the first economics book as such that I ever read was a book called The Cost of Economic Growth by a chap called E.J. Mission, written in 1967, when I was a sixth former, and I was a green already by that point. Heavily environmentally orientated, and then along came Small is Beautiful and everything else. What we were saying was that we had to join up the recovery from the economic crisis that we were sure was going to happen in banking, to tackle that climate crisis, that food biodiversity crisis. I have to admit, we've always been stronger on the climate crisis than we have on the biodiversity crisis. I think that's a weakness. I accept that it's a weakness. That still remains a feature of my work now. I'm critically aware of it. I wish I could do more about it, but in the areas where I in particular work around economics and accounting, biodiversity has proved harder to integrate into the work so far. And I've been told by all the people I've worked with, tackle the big one, what they call the big one, climate change first. How were we going to tackle climate change? Clearly, we needed to change the basis on which we were generating our power. So we had to move to sustainability, we had to move to renewables, and fundamentally, and the point that still day in, day out, I get frustrated by, because I write 3 or 4 blog posts every day, normally 3 or so before breakfast. Today was actually 6 blog posts. And I also did 7,000 words on other stuff today. I kind of have been writing almost continually since I was born, it seems. My perpetual companion is a keyboard. But one of my focuses has been very heavily on this issue of how do we deal with the fact that there's climate denial going on, and how do we tackle that issue? So we were trying to say, you can change the economy. And in particular, we focused on local, because that's been a long tradition in green. Colin Hines is a localist. He was formerly at Greenpeace, but he was heavily involved in local ideas and fed into the New Economics Foundation on that. I've always had a thing. Colin and I first got together to write about how to fund local development, local green development in 2003. That was the first thing we ever wrote together. And we were talking about how can we raise funding to actually empower local authorities, local areas to deliver change in their communities, because we believe there's a top-down element to this, but also a strong bottom-up element to this. And the line we came up with was that we were trying to create jobs in every community. And we were going to do that by creating what we called a carbon army. And the carbon army, which we still need, I mean, if ever anything, we need it much more now. There are 10 million people in this country at present in some degree of perilous employment. 2 million unemployed, 2 million who are on self-employed assistance at the moment with regard to their self-employment. So in other words, they are not functioning properly as self-employed people at present, and not sure they will be when the economy picks up. There are still over nearly 5 million people on furlough, and we know there's more than 1 million people who've fallen through the cracks. So add that all up, and we've got over 10 million people who are still at risk at this moment, even though we obviously hope we're going to have a recovery, presuming that we can keep COVID under control, and that's a big if. But we, from the outset, always made employment a focus. Now, we're not obsessive about employment in the sense that you've got to have your nose to the grindstone. Clearly, there's got to be a decent benefit system as well, and there's got to be support for people, and there's got to be a proper living wage to go with these things, critically a proper living wage. But we wanted there to be jobs in every community, which in a way that large-scale thinking completely fails. So we argued against, for example, HS2, because frankly, you can't turn HS2 on or off to fine tune the economy, but you can turn off the supply of the reform of housing. So retrofitting of houses. If the economy overheated, you can actually slow down the retrofitting. I think that's very unlikely that we're going to have an overheated economy, by the way. I think we're going to have an underheating economy for a long time in terms of employment. But we saw this as a way to literally put people to work and at the same time align that with these green goals. So a massive focus upon how do we create jobs. Now, not just obviously in retrofitting houses, but also in renewables and in transport and in building new housing and in infrastructure support so that we are not so carbon dependent. That was the key fundamental idea. But we also recognize that actually rather a lot of that does actually sound a bit like male jobs. Now, I'm not being sexist here, but that is what the outcome of that would have been. Too many of those jobs would have probably been biased towards male applicants, and I think that's a difficulty. There is obviously another dimension to this, which we've always emphasized. There is no limit within carbon constraints of the amount of good we can do for each other. It takes remarkably little carbon to care for people. It takes remarkably little carbon to teach people. It takes remarkably little carbon to entertain people, and in particular, local entertainment. So those things were also high on our agenda, and that replicates the thinking of the original New Deal, the 1930s Roosevelt New Deal, where amongst the things that were created were orchestras, which might sound bizarre, but actually this whole idea of actually dealing with the whole person was a part of the original New Deal idea. Now, Roosevelt had major weaknesses, not least, he was a racist. And, you know, I'm not too keen on that. So there were serious problems in some aspects of the original New Deal. Let's not copy everything. Let's learn the lessons from history and put what's bad behind us. But we were trying to pick up those lessons as well. So that was the focus of what we were trying to do. I'm not an environmentalist. I mean, I happen to be a professor of sustainability at the moment, which surprises me a bit, but actually that's largely because I'm working a lot at the moment on how to try to build sustainability into accounting frameworks and have devised a way to do that, which is getting some attention and is certainly not what the government is recommending. But what I am especially in is basically how economics works, and in particular how the interaction between the economy and taxation works. So when the question came up of how are we going to pay for this, I was heavily involved in that question, because everybody says, yeah, we can't do this, we can't afford it. And my answer is yes, we can. So from 2010, well, from 2003, Colin and I, as I've already said, were working on the idea of bonds so that we could redirect savings towards the Green New Deal. And Margaret Thatcher gutted the idea of local bonds. Until 1980, it was very common for local authorities to issue bonds to fund infrastructure work. Indeed, I can assure you that the original trams in Sheffield, not the new slick ones, but the old ones, which existed until around 1920 or so, were funded by local authority and bonds. The power and infrastructure and gas supply of Sheffield was actually supplied through local companies and the local authority. So this was a local authority job once upon a time. Localism and infrastructure went together. They don't anymore. Thatcher destroyed that because of her monetarist obsession of taking control of bond issues. We think that should be recreated. Since 2010, we've linked that to what we called green quantitative easing. And green quantitative easing is not like the conventional stuff that you've heard of, perhaps, which is what the government used to fund itself. Instead, it's focused very deliberately, not on bailing out banks, which is what most QE has done, and bailing out the financial markets, which is what the Bank of England says it should do, but instead in providing the funding to specifically invest in communities to deliver the Green New Deal. We think that cost is 100 billion a year. Now, since we started, and I'm going to end up on one point just to show how easy it would be to fund the Green New Deal. Since we began, QE has become a major part of the funding environment of the UK. In 2008, it had never happened. It started in 2009, and right now over £800 billion of QE money has been created. By created, I literally mean that somebody in the Bank of England picks up one of those and taps some numbers into it, and as a result, new money is created. That is how money is made in the UK. There is no magic to it. There's no magic money tree. There's just a keyboard. And all it says is, I owe you. All money is debt. And the money is created in this case by the Bank of England basically lending money to the Treasury, and then it being spent into the economy to buy back government bonds. Now, that could be used to buy back bonds issued for the Green New Deal instead. That's how we would fund the process. Now, the point about that is that we've issued 800 billion, and there has been no inflation of any consequence as a result. There is no sign of any real inflation. If you see discussion of inflation coming, I can't see the hint of it. And I'm interested to see that in the US yesterday, the chair of the Federal Reserve said that she doesn't see any sign of inflation, even though markets say there is. That's because they're trying to be basically in America anti-democrat and pro-Republican, and so spreading rumors that there's going to be inflation. They've said this for decades. It won't happen. So there is no inflation element to this, and you can't get basically domestically created inflation. And I stress domestically created inflation unless you got full employment. Well, we haven't got full employment. I've just explained there's lots of people in perilous employment situations. So we're going to continue injecting money into the economy. The downside of injecting money into the economy is it has to go somewhere. And you might think it goes obviously into the NHS first of all, and supporting benefits first of all, and everything else. But actually, because of the way the economy works, of course, the people who receive the money spend the money. And in the end, and that cycle carries on and on, everybody receives the money, they spend the money, they receive the money, they spend the money. And all that money from QE trickles upwards. Actually, it doesn't trickle upwards, it floods upwards. And the research I've done shows that actually over the last year, something like 250 billion, maybe more now, maybe approaching 300 billion, because the numbers are going up rapidly by the month, of money has been saved as a consequence of the QE that's been injected into the economy. Almost all of the QE money ends up saved. And most of that is, of course, saved by a small part of society. Large business has about 100 billion of that, and wealthy people have the rest. And bluntly, we need to tax those wealthy people. We either need to tax them to redistribute, and I think we do, not because we need their money, we can create as much money as we want, but because they are wealthy. And because they are wealthy, they do not spend. That's how wealthy people become wealthy. They don't spend. And it's very simple. They have money left over at the end of the week. Most people don't. And we need to allocate the money to the people who need money to get through to the end of the week. And that way, we will actually increase the level of demand for the things that we're talking about. Entertainment, education, things that are not necessarily heavy consumers of carbon, but which meet people's needs. And we need to do something else. And this is what Colin and I have looked at. The UK government subsidises savings, and almost all savings are by the wealthy, by definition. It has subsidised savings each year for the last few years by something like 60 billion a year. 55 billion a year goes into subsidising pension contributions. That is as much as is spent on school education is used to subsidise pensioners. And in addition, ISAs pick up several billion more a year. Our idea is very simple. We just think that green bonds, which would be used to fund the Green New Deal, should be the only thing available in ISAs. And we think that a quarter of all pension contributions should go into projects which do fund the Green New Deal or fund new employment in green-related projects. If we did that, we could fund over 100 billion of money into the Green New Deal each year. If we did that, we would have the transformation that we need within 10 years to be heading for a net zero carbon economy. We could quite literally build the world that we need and the services that we want, and train the people to work with them, and provide the long-term employment for young people and the training that they require, and rebuild the intergenerational gap, because savers tend to be older people, they've got my color hair, and the people who need jobs tend to be younger people, and therefore they tend to be at the start of their careers. So an intergenerational element to this as well. This is the type of thinking that we as a group, Colin and I in particular, because we kept the website going, frankly, during the years when very few people paid much attention to the Green New Deal. From 2011 to 2017, almost nobody paid us any attention at all, by the way. It was virtually dormant, except for Colin and I knocking out a paper every 6 months. And then it redeveloped because we got in touch with AOC, or rather she got in touch with us actually, and it went to the States and it began to go ballistic there and re-imported back into here, which is fantastic. But this is the sort of idea that we create throughout the group. The original group are always focused upon creating solutions to problems, big solutions for big problems. We've got big problems, but the big solutions are available. We could have a Green New Deal is my message to you tonight. It's possible. We could do it. We could fund it. We could have the jobs. We could have the benefits. We can be net zero carbon, and we can transform our agriculture. I believe all that can be done, and that's why I work on it. That's it. That's me. Questions?
Well, thank you very much, Richard. I think you've given us a lot to talk about. I just want to start the questions. I hope people don't mind. If it's that simple, why doesn't it happen? I mean, it makes sense. Why doesn't it happen?
Because people don't want it to happen, let's be blunt. We are talking about, when doing this, fundamentally changing the balance within the economy. First of all, as I've mentioned, this would actually require effectively wealth redistribution. And unsurprisingly, the wealthy aren't very keen on that. They also feel themselves pretty disjointed from the rest of the economy. Bluntly, they feel they can go to New Zealand and buy their way out of this. The ultra wealthy don't think that this is their issue. They believe everything happens, outside the gates, wherever their gates are. So they aren't very convinced. The government is only interested in skimming off wealth for the benefit of their cronies. When people, when I used to say that, nobody believed me. After PPE, I think most people do believe me. But I think that's the case. And you've got to understand that we have a manufacturing-based, I know manufacturing is not enormous, but consumption-based economy, if you like, about acquiring things. Most of those things are not essential to our well-being. I mean, there are things which I obviously buy, which are important. I mean, I could not survive, I could not work without the computer I'm talking to you on now. I need, some of the material things I own, and they are essential to my well-being. But frankly, there's a lot of stuff that a lot of people consume that frankly is frippery and unnecessary. And we all, I suspect here, recognize that. But the wealthy, the structure of our society, the capitalist nature of society is it's dedicated to growth. It believes it has to keep on supplying more. The debt empowered nature of our economy requires people to keep on being in debt and to keep on enslaving people with debt to keep the financial system going. And we therefore are proposing something which deeply disrupts that. Because that is deeply disruptive, of course, they don't like it. It's why, getting political traction for this is hard. I was involved in writing that Green New Deal bill with Caroline and Clive, both of whom I've worked with. Clive is now a member of the Green New Deal group, which is nice because we have a Labour MP in the Green New Deal group as well, which sort of indicates this important multi-party dimension to this issue. And Caroline and Clive seem to work together a great deal with organisations like Compass. And again, I think that's good news. But the resistance is very high because we challenge the conventional hierarchy of economics that says, pile the goods high, sell them cheap, push people into debt, keep them in debt, keep them funding the banking system as a result, and keep them happy with literally these types of consumption goods, which basically indicate status in society. We are challenging as well that idea of society based upon status. There's no doubt about that. That's implicit in what we're doing. I think that's implicit in the overall green idea that we're not hanging our sort of well-being on this consumption. And therefore, we end up with this challenge between our worldview and their worldview. And at the moment, they're still prevailing.
Okay, well, thank you. So I am going to read the questions now from the chat room. So you just give me a few minutes while I get down to the first question. I'm
looking at them as well.
Yeah. The first one from Aisha Suleiman, I think. Is veganism and rewilding included in the deal? And I guess I'd like your thoughts on that, Richard.
Look, I mean, was it ever included in the original version? No, it wasn't, because we were economically focused in 2008 about a crisis to come. We talked about the need for biodiversity, but as I said, we've been less relevant. I'm not a vegan. I actually am not a vegetarian, although I'm kind of pretty much heading there. I've noticed that this week there won't be any meat in my diet. So I'm sort of moving in that direction. I think my wife's got something to do with that as well, because she's certainly more inclined to be vegetarian than I am. Rewilding quite emphatically is, because clearly rewilding is essential as part of the biodiversity issue. And that means we have to tackle some pretty difficult entrenched interests. There are a lot of hill farms in Wales who are not going to be willing to give up their sheep too easily, and the same in the Lake District. They don't like that idea. Because if we're talking about rewilding some territories which simply should not be farmed in the way that they are, and if we talk about rewilding some of the farms around where I live in East Anglia, which are enormous acreages, vast fields, they're going to be people upset by it. We're again challenging their perceptions of what it is to do certain things and what their communities do. I don't think we have a choice but upset people. I mean, as I put on Twitter recently, I plead guilty. I'm annoying. 10 years in prison is coming my way by the sound of it, because that's what Priti Patel is offering me in exchange for this. And I'm quite noisy on occasions too. So my belief is that it is implicit that we are heading towards a lower carbon consumption society, which necessarily means we must move away from meat production, and it means that we must be moving towards rewilding. I think it's absolutely implicit in it, but it is not as explicitly stated as many people would like, and I accept the point.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question I can see is, do you see modern monetary theory as being a crucial element of a contemporary Green New Deal?
Look, I'm seen as an exponent of modern monetary theory in the UK, and I'm also, as well and simultaneously, a critic of some aspects of modern monetary theory. For those who don't know what modern monetary theory is, effectively it says that the government can create money. We know that's true. QE has done it. So in some senses, the revelation that the government can create money to fund its activities has been proven to be true over the last year. Only half of government spending in the last year has been funded by tax. Actually, MMT says none of it is funded by tax. Every single penny that is spent by the government is actually, in the first instance, created by the Bank of England and spent into the economy. And the role of tax is to actually bring that money back out of the economy to control inflation. And that's a fact too, although long denied. In fact, that process became the law in the UK in 1866. There's not much modern about modern monetary theory when it's been basically the underpinning of the UK government's funding system since 1866. It was actually a joke, the modern bit, which was actually, it's not that modern, but I'm afraid the joke has fallen flat far too often since then to be, so don't worry about that. It's not even a very good theory. It's a description of what actually happens. Quite simply, this is what happens. The government does spend and it taxes afterwards. But what that means is that we can view the role of tax in a very different way, and we can review the role of government deficits in a very different way, and we can review the role of borrowing in a very different way. Now, I happen to think deficits, borrowing and tax all have a role, but we don't need to obsess about what the government always wants to talk about, which is balancing the books. We don't talk about balancing the books because it makes no sense whatsoever unless you are a bookkeeper. Now, perhaps the government is made up of bookkeepers and I know how to do double entry. So yeah, in that sense, I can balance the books. I'm interested in balancing the economy. And as far as I'm concerned, we have a balanced economy when we have full employment and a level of economic activity that guarantees our children can enjoy a sustainable world of the same type that we should be enjoying now, but which we're obviously over consuming. That is my definition of balancing the economy. MMT has that focus. It's clearly implicit in the Green New Deal. It's very clearly implicit in the American version of this, where Stephanie Kelton is advising. Stephanie has her new book out, I think, very soon in the UK, and you'll find my name endorsing it on the back cover. So yeah, I'm pretty linked to this stuff, but it isn't fundamental to understand modern monetary theory to understand what we're talking about with regard to green QE and this idea of redirecting savings to fund the Green New Deal. So we simplify it. I mean, that is a simplification. So what? It explains to people who ask the question, how do you pay for it? There are at the moment 12 trillion pounds worth of financial assets in the UK, total assets in the UK. 81% of those are in tax incentivized assets. We're saying change the tax incentives to push the money towards the Green New Deal. I don't think that's rocket science. I think that makes common sense. And it means that the money would flow where the tax directed it. And that's why we say, literally, change the tax incentives, we'll get the 100 billion a year that is needed to invest in what we want.
Oh, right. So thank you for that. I've got a question from Alexi Dimond. Would you support UBI in the same way?
I've done a lot of work on UBI, not recently. I did quite a bit with a chap called Howard Reid, who's a really good economist, quite left-wing, done a lot of work with the government of Wales in particular. Some regional mayors have used him too. He was at the Institute for Fiscal Studies once, and we modelled UBI. Now, UBI is basically providing everybody with a universal basic income. Now, clearly, universal credit doesn't work. We all know universal credit is A, too low, and B, creates a massive problem when people move out of universal credit into work. There are tax rates of up to 80% on marginal money earned in that situation. So for every extra £1 you earn while moving from universal credit alone to work, you can pay up to 80p in tax because of the combination of paying tax, paying national insurance, and losing benefits. So if the really wealthy were paying tax at 80%, they'd be yelling, screaming and shouting. But when people who are earning 15,000 quid a year do it, apparently that's perfectly okay. Well, clearly it isn't. And so UBI tries to overcome that problem and tries to provide everybody with a basic income. So poverty should be eliminated. Howard and I modelled a universal basic income of 16,000 a year for everybody with a lower figure for children. On the basis that was 2/3 of national average wage at the time. And that is the definition of poverty. Now, what we found was that this would require paying very high rates of income tax or VAT. People will be paying 70 to 80% rates of income tax on around £80,000 of income. Now, £80,000 of income is a lot of money. And you would have had 16,000 quid a year tax-free, let's be clear, from the government as a universal basic income, even though you were earning 70,000 quid. So you might say, well, what's your problem? That would be my answer. The difficulty is, politically, I don't think that works. I don't think we are anywhere near to accepting that sort of level of tax to provide a universal basic income as yet. So I'm afraid I don't think that politically we're near it. I focus instead on providing a job guarantee, but obviously I would like there to be a much better benefit system and a benefit system that integrates vastly better with the tax system than it does at present, so that there was actually a maximum tax rate payable as people withdraw from universal credit. In other words, quite simply, they will continue to get payment to make sure that they did not suffer these enormous penalties on shifting from from universal credit into work. I think that's possible. I think that can be engineered. But my focus has been more upon providing jobs than it has been, therefore, on providing universal basic income. There are exceptions. I think that there are some very good reasons for providing incentives for people to, for example, set up their own businesses. I think that's extremely useful. But I would call that universal capital, actually providing people with the start in life. You know, economists, including at the University of Sheffield, I'll tell you, will teach their students that let's assume everybody has the same amount of capital and it's all distributed equally in society. Well, there's naive assumption number one. We know that 70% of people have virtually no savings, and most children will never, ever inherit anything of any consequence. So capital is massively unfairly distributed in society. So there should be opportunity to provide that. And of course, one way to do that is to provide education for as long as we can. I mean, I work in Copenhagen some of the time, haven't been there for a long time now, for obvious reasons. But I do work at Copenhagen Business School, where I sometimes teach. And there, every single person is entitled to education free of charge up to 7 years after leaving school. Now, that provides, again, another version of this universal capital, because people are provided with the skills that they want and for as long as they need to acquire them to make sure they have the opportunity that life should provide. So I think there's a range of issues rather than one. I don't think it's universal basic income alone. I don't think it's a job guarantee alone. I think it's a range of policies to make sure that the variety of people's needs are met. And, you know, we're all different. I don't like single solution answers.
Okay, well, the questions are coming thick and fast.
Oh, right.
Do you see a place for local currencies in Green New Deal activities? And that's from Colin McCulloch.
I've been looking at local currencies for a very long time. I mean, the Bristol pound, the Brixton pound, and various other ones all over the place. I actually am not really persuaded, never have been really persuaded of them. The only benefit of a local currency that I can honestly offer to you is that the money stays circulating inside the local community. So it does, therefore, actually encourage people to shop locally and with, by and large, smaller businesses in their community. And I like that. I mean, I do that where I live here. I live in a place with only, you know, there are 18,000 of us or something like that. And I go out of my way to shop whenever I can with local shops. We haven't got a local currency, but that's just my preference. But do local currencies actually have any real substance? No. Why? Because you'll actually find the moment you introduce one, you've got to come to an agreement with HM Revenue and Customs that there has to be a fixed exchange rate between your currency and the pound so that they can tax you in your local currency. So that if a local shop is paid in it, they can A, charge VAT still, and they know what rate they're going to charge that VAT at, and B, they can charge you to income tax on it. So the reality is, all the local currency does is encourage local circulation of money. Now, I've got no problem with that, but it isn't the only way to encourage people to shop locally.
Okay. And then I have a question from Gillian. What evidence is there that people spend this new money, this, you know, the Green New Deal money, for example, on low carbon activities rather than stuff?
Oh, look, what we're talking about is redirecting government money. So we're not telling people they can't buy stuff. What we're saying is that actually we're going to put people to work to build the infrastructure. And what I'm also saying is that the government needs to regulate at the same time to make sure that we move towards a low carbon economy. Some of the work I'm working on at the moment is about how we change accounting regulation to require companies to become net zero carbon by 2040, or be declared carbon insolvent, which literally means, sorry, you've got to go out of business. You can't meet the criterion that we need to meet to ensure we have a sustainable world. And it would be possible to do that. We could literally change the accounting rules to force companies to become net zero carbon or face literally going out of business. And when you put a stick like that over a business, I tell you, nothing speeds innovation faster. We know that compulsion and need can result in massively fast innovation. The fact that we have got vaccines, and I'm sure some of you will have been vaccinated, I have been vaccinated, now with regard to COVID-19, is the result of the urgency of the situation. If we put a rocket under business and tell us it's got to do something, it tends to do it. So people can't be stopped buying what they want now, but what we need to do is change what people are offered to buy so that what they're offered to buy is low carbon. And the only way to do that is to actually change the regulations on what businesses can sell. But what we have to do is provide the infrastructure so that business itself is going to be able to buy electricity that is renewable, and that they can buy other resources that are renewable and that we can recycle, and that agriculture can be run on a renewable basis, and so on. So it isn't any one factor, But the reality is that it's intensely difficult to be net zero carbon at the moment as a household. Mine isn't. I'm well aware of it. I try, we've got green electricity tariffs, and I'm a bit obsessive about turning off as much as possible around the house and fighting my son, who forgets all the time to switch off every light switch. You've probably suffered the same problem at some point with a late teenage child, and so on. But we're not. Why? Because quite simply, there isn't a viable way for us to be as net zero carbon as I want. Living in a relatively rural area, we need a car. That car is not net zero carbon. At some point it will be. The fact that the government is requiring that cars stop being petrol or diesel cars from 2030 is going to force that process of change in a way that nothing else can. I will have to buy an electric car because there won't be another one. That's sort of the option that's readily available now. So it's a combination of actually making sure that we have the right investment, that business can become net zero carbon itself, which is what the Green New Deal should be doing in no small part. And it has the right option to reduce carbon consumption, which is again why we're so keen on house retrofitting, for example, and the fitting of heat converters and so on, because I think that's critical. But at the same time, also putting in place the regulation to require business to change, so that in the future, the only options we have available to us when we go out to buy are basically ones that are going to be consistent with this goal of net zero carbon.
Thank you, Richard. Are you okay to carry on?
Yes, let's keep going.
Yeah. Okay, so here's one. Given that the majority of QE money is being saved, isn't that the primary reason that inflation hasn't increased? If the money was given to consumers, wouldn't inflation rise?
Well, the money was given to people, obviously. I mean, QE was spent into the economy. It wasn't given to financial markets per se. The reason why there was a deficit was because we spent money on supporting people's well-being over the last year. We supported the NHS. We spent 37 billion on track and trace. That was a great success. But it did actually end up in people's pockets, and not all the consultants. Obviously, people did actually go to work, even if they did remarkably little when they got there, and so on. But the trouble is that, some of that money was directly saved, and some did undoubtedly go straight into large businesses when it shouldn't have done. But most of it actually ends up in the hands of the wealthy because, as I've already explained, money circulates. So what happens is that the money goes for a reason, supporting a person who's on furlough, and they spend money at Tesco's. And Tesco spends the money on wages, but some of it goes into the profit of Tesco's. And then the person at Tesco's who spends the money, again, buys something somewhere else, and part of that goes into the profit of another store or whatever else. And gradually the money all goes up. Now, there is this massive rate of saving as a result. We've also seen a lot of money being used to fuel increase in asset prices. House prices have gone up absurdly over the last year as a result of QE. And so what we've seen is an increase in wealth. Now, will people start spending again? This is a massive debate in economics at the moment. According to Andy Haldane, who is the chief economist of the Bank of England, who doesn't much love me and I don't much love him, I think it's fair to say, he says that we're sitting on a coiled spring and that everybody is sitting on savings and they're all going to go out into the economy and spend like never before. And therefore, we are going to see inflation developing. Well, my answer to him is what you're going to buy. First of all, what most people are missing is meals out, but you can only eat one meal out a day, I guess. And after a while, you actually begin to get bored of that because there aren't people to go and eat with. You can go on holiday, but you can't make up for all the holidays you missed. People aren't going to go on holiday for 3 months in a row now. They're going to have a good holiday, but they're not going to make up for everyone they missed. So that isn't possible, I believe, for all that spending to flow back into the economy. Nor do I think people are going to buy lots of extra widgets, things to buy, toys to play with, because actually the evidence is they've done that during lockdown. People who have actually been spending on things through Amazon, love them or hate them, and they don't much love me either because I put their tax affairs into the international arena. But they've been doing well out of this because they've been supplying so many of those things already. So what it's honestly thought people are going to spend much money on, I don't know. I mean, I have got a holiday booked in late June. I'm coming to Yorkshire, by the way. That's because I've got a son at Leeds University and I'm going to actually go and see him and we're going to go walking in the Dales. But, I think there's going to be some spend, but of the 250 odd billion, how much do I think might be splurged over this summer or early autumn? 50 billion maybe? Is that going to create any significant inflation? No. Is it going to be enduring? No. I think a lot of people are actually going to carry on with their saving, and a lot of that saving has actually already been saved in a way that is not reversible. Because what's actually happened is a lot of people have paid down their debts, including their mortgages, over the last year. A lot of mortgages have been paid down quicker than expected. Now, people aren't going to now suddenly go out and say, can I up my mortgage again? Just start spending. I think they've actually been clearing debt. So I don't see it reversing. I don't see there's a big inflation risk in the economy at the moment. I could be wrong, but I can't see where it's going to come from.
Okay, I think we're going to be coming to the end because there's lots more
I can go for a few minutes after 8 if people want to. That's up to you.
Okay, well, here's a question. South Yorkshire missed out on a Freeport in the budget. What do you think of Freeports?
I wrote the biggest submission on Freeports that was sent to the government as a part of their consultation. And indeed, I was one of only 2 people who actually took part in their face-to-face consultations, which were Zoom, of course, in the end of the day. I hate Freeports. I've written 2 books on tax havens. Freeports are tax havens. What happens in a Freeport is that there are lower rates of tax, there are light touch regulations, and there is a slackness with regards to, for example, employment law, planning law. Local authorities aren't allowed to raise as much money from charging land taxes, so business rates, and so on. The evidence from around the world is very clear. Freeports are associated with corruption, crime, smuggling, tax evasion. They've got lots of things going for them. The one thing they don't do is create many new jobs. They do tend to relocate jobs. So I have to say that there will be jobs relocated from Sheffield now to Hull and Grimsby. Well, you've got to be sad to move from Sheffield to Hull or Grimsby, and I won't say that too loud. I think I'd rather stay in Sheffield myself. I can see at least one person smiling at that idea. That was meant to be a joke, not an insult to Hull and Grimsby. I quite like Hull. But so there will be some jobs relocated, but there's very little evidence that new jobs are created. The government claims they're going to be hubs for innovation. What, you mean cutting the amount of business rates that is paid by a company creates innovation? Really? Why? What's the link? There's no evidence of that. It's much more likely that there'll be a lot more drugs flowing through Hull and Grimsby than there were before. There could be some more human trafficking because there won't be sufficient checks on anything landing. Particular problem in Hull, not so much in Grimsby. But so I'm afraid to say I have absolutely no faith in Freeports. And do you know what? David Cameron got rid of them in 2012 because the Tories looked at a Labour version of Freeports almost identical to what is being introduced now and said, this doesn't work, let's get rid of it. For once, I have to say David Cameron was right. There's not many times when I am on record as saying that. But on this occasion, he got rid of them. They were a failure and they will be again. They will not provide an answer to anywhere, and that you missed out is not a great deal. Instead, you need a mayor who's willing to look at how the mayor can borrow to fund local innovation. Sheffield needs a green bond.
Okay, thank you. I'm very aware that we haven't actually let Rosh say anything about any of these questions.
Yeah, Rosh, come on, jump in.
So have you got any comments or anything you'd like to talk about, Rosh?
I'm not an economist, so I can't speak with any authority on the questions that have already been asked, but I think I'd like to stress, some people have been asking about how can we build the broad coalitions that I talked about at the beginning. I think it's absolutely fundamental that we support trade union organising. No party of the left has won in this country without an increase in trade union density or membership. And in times of inequality like that we live in, parties of the right weaponize social conservatism to win electoral majorities. And they do this because most people in this country support economically left-wing policies. They want utilities to be nationalised. They want a higher tax rate on higher earners. They want public services to be owned by the state or other models of ownership, not privatisation and deregulation. deregulation. And the only bulwark against the weaponization of social conservatism is the political education and the political consciousness that is raised by trade union organizing. We've seen a massive decline in the power of unions since a high in 1979. And what we need to do is support the unions that are particularly organizing workers in the lowest paid occupations and in the most casualized occupations. So we've got lots of young people, lots of young working class BAME workers in hospitality and retail, which are have very low union density. If we can increase that union density and support the unions that are organizing workers in those occupations, we can build constituencies who want to support Green New Deal policies. So what I would say is, myself and a friend from the Green Party, Ben, are running a project to support trade union organising, and we hope to speak to the Sheffield Green Party eventually about this. But I will just put our project in the chat, have a look and consider supporting. We're trying to support and fundraise trade union organising in Rotherham, and if that model works, we can then take that around the country and build the power of workers around the country.
Can I just say, I really support that idea. I think it's absolutely fundamental. I've been a member of a trade union every time I've been employed. I will be back in UCU once I'm employed again. I'm not a member of a union at the moment because I'm out of employment right now. But the TUC, Unite and PCS have all supported my work over time. However, they have not bought heavily into the Green New Deal. There is some sign of support from the TUC, but most unions have some difficulties normally with representing groups who actually could be prejudiced by the Green New Deal. And there is a problem quite often. Unison has had major problems in supporting, for example, some aspects of the Green New Deal because it represents workers in the nuclear industry, and the Green New Deal, as I see it, is not pro-nuclear.
Okay.
So there are conflicts that have to be overcome in that approach, Rocha, which I think is important to be open about and to address in due course.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of put the last open question now, and it's a focus on Sheffield and South Yorkshire. I mean, you just mentioned in response to an earlier question, Richard, about Sheffield bonds and things. So what do we need to do in this area, and what can we push for? So this is for both of you, Rosh and Richard. If you've got
your patch.
Well, I already spoke about the work that Green New Deal UK South Yorkshire are doing. So we have different working groups. One of them is on retrofitting, where we've already had some success pushing for Dan Jarvis to include in his deal funding for retrofitting. And we've also had a conference on sustainable food practices. There's lots of local organic growers in the South Yorkshire region who are thinking really hard about how we can improve food security. So those are two areas of work that we're working on. And there are more as well. If you'd like to help us out in those streams of work, please do join us. We think they're incredibly important, but we need the support of everyone else to make them happen. And we are focusing, like I said, on the local elections, making sure candidates support the Green New Deal. And we are continuing to put pressure on Dan Jarvis to make sure that any funding that is given to Build Back Better in South Yorkshire absolutely has the Green New Deal principles entrenched in it. So yeah, that's what we're doing in the local area.
Thank you.
And I just recommend a couple of bits of reading, really. They're by a think tank you may not have heard of. It's called Commonweal. Commonweal is a Scottish think tank. It's not Commonwealth. That's a UK think tank. Commonweal is very definitely a Scottish think tank based in Glasgow. They produced a thing called the Common Home Plan. It's got this rather nice cover, and it's worth looking at because it's their version of a Green New Deal, written for Scotland, but presuming that Scotland is still within the UK, therefore working within the constraints that are imposed on Holyrood, which are not so different as the constraints which are imposed upon a mayor. and how to actually manage that to deliver a Green New Deal despite that. And I think it's a really good program that it outlines, because it's really innovative, particularly with regard to agriculture, where lots of ideas are present in that. And the idea and the focus is on how things can be done locally, building local economies. And it's this idea that you start from the bottom. And I entirely agree that retrofitting is a clear part to that. Yeah, there are, I'm quite sure, a lot of young people in Sheffield right now who do need career paths and some certainty. There is 15 years of work ahead of us in retrofitting buildings. There are 30 million properties in the UK, of which probably 25 million need some remedial action. Yeah, that is thousands of properties a week. It is hundreds of properties a month in Sheffield alone. There are jobs here to keep Sheffield going for ages. And those should be strong, local, unionised, well-represented employments, which will continue. So it's that sort of idea that to me is where you take the focus. But it's not just that, it's also talking about the whole approach of the local authority and how it can influence everything about its policy, down to if it still has influence over school meals and where it does, and I know it doesn't always, but how it can try to require there to be support for green in that area, anything you can think of. Transport. Now, I know you've got a good new metro system, but there's other aspects and everything else about how you integrate to make sure that you think about green in all the policies that are put forward. But as a job creation program, I'd start with retrofitting. But agriculture is also true, and really innovative thinking is necessary there, because some of the options which are available are staggering.
Right, well, I think our time is up, so I think if we could all express our thanks to Richard. I'm not sure how we do this, we can do it this way, and to Rosh. Thank you very much, Rosh and Richard. I'm sure they've given us a lot to think about. I mean, I'm happy to keep this open for a few minutes if you want to chat amongst yourself, but thank you, Richard. You can enjoy your meal and your next your chat with your son. So thank you very much.
Cheerio. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.